Hello and welcome to Market Meditations, a podcast created to give you, our listeners, a way to join our journey on learning more about ourselves and in general how to become better human beings, which of course leads to us becoming better investors. I am as always joined by my co-host, Chris Haydel.
All opinions expressed by Neal, Mody, Chris Haydel, and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Zoic Capital or Haydel Beal and Associates. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.
The big time stuff that I wish I had. The big time stuff that'll make you mad. The big time stuff. I like the big time stuff. I like the big time stuff that I never had.
Today's episode will feature a very special guest, Dirk van den Boom. Chris and I both have the good fortune of getting a chance to invest in Dirk's first startup. He successfully led his last company to a more than $300 million acquisition by LabCorp in the prenatal diagnostic space. Throughout this episode, Dirk shares his thoughts on COVID-19, how he sees the market evolving for diagnostics, and the evolution of the market in general. We hope you enjoyed today's episode, and if you do, please consider leaving us a rating or a comment, or both. Without further ado, let's get into it.
Dirk, welcome to the show. We didn't do an exact intro for you, so maybe you can give a brief, meaning please don't take 10 minutes, introduction of
there's
yourself.
much more than 10 minutes for you, Dirk. That's deserving.
Well, good. I'll do that. First of all, thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this. Neal, a long time ago, it feels like.
I think you were the first listener, Dirk, ever.
Thank you, Dirk.
I don't think it was quite that, but I definitely listened into the podcast, and it helped me also. It's important to understand how people think, and so you try to get as much information as you can, and the podcast is one of them. Mm-hmm. So with that being said, obviously I'm Dirk van den Boom. I'm I would say a healthcare executive with over a 20-year career, mainly in genetic testing and diagnostics. I had a very long tenure in a previous company called Sequenom, publicly traded company that I joined pretty much right out of my program for molecular biology in Hamburg, Germany, where I did my PhD. And it was in the times when we were still, in the phase of trying to decipher the human genome and sequencing it, and actually very similar to a lot of other programs that had ambitious goals that weren't reached for a long time. It still spurred a lot of innovation in new technologies. And so I spent my time developing mass spectrometry-based methods for genetic testing that turned out to be, with colleagues, one of the leading technology in the early 2000s for analyzing genetic mutations and polymorphisms, as we call them, and then went on with Sequenom as a company to develop and commercialize the first non-invasive prenatal test for fetal chromosomal aberrations by just needing a maternal blood draw rather than an invasive procedure like amniocentesis and CVS. And so really the goal there was to avoid all the non-necessary invasive procedures that can lead to a fetal loss versus being able to just do a blood draw and see if there truly is a potential issue. And that was very rewarding and very eye-opening as well in terms of how you do medical innovation in the current healthcare environment and how you bring it to market and how you try to, make it a financial success as well. And there's a lot of hurdles in that. And I'm sure we're going to cover some of those topics today. So I also founded Juno, and that's how Neal and I
Juno Diagnostics, to be clear, not therapeutics.
Juno Diagnostics, to be specific, yeah. So nobody mixes it up with Juno Therapeutics. But eventually we're going to be a multi-billion dollar company too, right, Neal?
My only worry about you is that you sell early, Dirk. Like somebody gives you an offer for $400 million and you're out.
So, and Chris, we have met in that regard as well. And really, there, and we'll talk more about that. It was looking back at all the experiences I'd done made before, and seeing what is the next phase that we really need in order to bring high value medical information to patients and consumers, and give them a better empowerment to take care of their health and improving the patient-physician relationship. And a lot of it has to do with democratizing access, reducing costs, improving turnaround time, and making access easier. So don't want to take too much of that because we'll talk about that more. But that's the background on me.
So, one of the reasons I was excited to work with you and was super happy to have you on this podcast is I learn a lot from you every time. And I also wonder when I'm face to face with you, why you didn't become a basketball player. Dirk, just to let you know, could easily fit in as a center in the NBA, just as easily as he could be, the head of a public company and sell to LabCorp like you did. But in addition to that, at his last company, and I don't know what he can talk about and what he can't, he had to clean up a lot of fraud that existed. And he did it in very short order and got to a very large exit for the shareholders, and created even had a couple divestitures that right at the end that really added to the shareholder value. And then when, as soon as he's done with that 24-month sprint, he goes out and he starts another company with the exact same management team. And so it's hard not to admire how he looks at the world. And so, we were pretty excited to both invest in your company and get a chance to just spend more time talking to you. I think most of the time when I'm with you, I want to listen, not talk. So I was hoping today we might explore, we might learn just a little bit about what you're doing at Juno with what you're happy to share about. Also, we might spend a little bit of time, I hate to spend too much time on COVID-19, but you do have a particular insight, as I've learned over the last 7 hours worth of calls about it with you. And maybe some of the upcoming trends in, the next decade you're excited to see with breakthroughs in biology and technology being commercialized and actually coming to the market.
Yeah. And I mean, at the same time, as much as we all talk about COVID quite a bit, we have to, because it has been extremely impactful on everybody, not only on the on businesses, but also on every human being, right? It's, as we all know, being sheltered at home is not the easiest thing. There's many people who are financially impacted, but it goes throughout every aspect of life. And
maybe let's kick off there with COVID-19. We'll try and limit the subject to 10 minutes. Callahan, you can put us on a timer. Maybe take us through some of the dilemma you have with your father and newborn, and how you're thinking about these things and why it makes you pause and where your decision analysis is now. And Chris will ask lots of intelligent questions, and I'll try and ask one.
Yeah. No, I think that's actually a great intro, because usually things become the most tangible when you're personally impacted, right? That has always been the case. It's different if you look at something from the outside or if you're on the inside. In this case, COVID, we're all on the inside, because everybody I talk to is somehow impacted by it. And from my perspective, I was so lucky to be the father of a now 7.5 months old daughter. My father lives in Germany, and so the natural thing for me was I wanted to fly to Germany with my family and show him the next offspring, if you want. And he's 90 years old, and while we had this all planned out, and we're wanting to go, February comes by, you start to get worried where and how is this going to go, and March comes by and you can't travel anymore. And I think the frustrating part for all of us was there was no testing available. I think a lot of people feel they had symptoms, but they weren't sure that they have COVID, that they not have COVID, couldn't get tested because of non-availability of testing or restrictions and who can get tested. Fast forward, now you're entering the phase where, well, if you're not actively infected, even if you could get tested for that, it's too late. How do I know if I have antibodies? What does it mean to have antibodies? But eventually, if we make this personal, I want to know, when can I travel again with the family? When is it safe to travel? And when can I travel and not bring a potential COVID infection home to my dad, who at 90 years old, will be, of course, in the high risk category. And so if you take that and you look at the landscape, a lot of it reminds me of what was kind of the genesis of Juno Diagnostics, which is we need to disrupt and revamp how we think about diagnostic testing. And in the go back to February, March, everybody is worried about getting infected, and in order to find out, do I just have flu, do I have a cold, whatever, you need to see a doctor. But nobody wants to go into an emergency room or urgent care room, because if you don't have COVID, if you have something else, are you exposing yourself to the risk of getting infected by somebody else in that area, room, that actually has it? And so people try to stay away from it, because you either try to have your home remedies, or you go through it, but you're not looking forward to it. And so having better ways of testing for infections and other things at home, and then being able to triage, is kind of where we need to go. And I think this pandemic just reminds us of it, that we need to improve that whole workflow in what information can you gather at home, what can you bring to a physician, so you're already triaged, and then that way the physician can look at everything, symptoms, any test results, and make a treatment decision right away, versus the traditional model that we all go through, which is, I'm not sure I'm feeling well, I need to make an appointment, I need to see a doctor. The doctor takes my vitals, my symptoms, then arranges for a blood draw that very likely they can't do themselves, and it's another appointment, and that sample needs to be sent to a centralized processing lab. A couple of days later, results come back, and then the doctor can make decisions. That's just highly inefficient. In particular, with something as infectious as COVID, that's not what you want to go through. And I think in the future, and there will be a lot of innovation coming out of this, this all needs to be done very differently. And having, if you want, ubiquitous at-home testing devices that can at least produce useful information to triage is where we need to go. Telehealth, I think, is another aspect that needs to become much more common. We're forcing this today in the current environment, because we're all sheltered at home. And that was probably the trigger for the whole world to be much more focused on what is it that can be done in a remote setting, right? It goes through all aspects of life, right? Telehealth is one, as we all know. Ordering food online and having it delivered at home is the other side of this. But I think it will just show you how things will evolve forced by nature in this case. And I think a lot of it's going to be a good change, but it was very impactful to have to go through this. So to some degree, when we formed Juno, of course, we didn't think about a pandemic, but we thought about the exact issue that we're having right now, which is, how do you give people an opportunity to do testing at home, create valuable information that will help manage their health and wellness, as well as potentially their disease, right, as you go forward. And that's a very important point that comes out of this. The other aspect which feeds into this, that specific to COVID, we're all now worried about, is, well, how do you go about antibody testing? What are you testing for? When do you test this?
Yes.
And it's the same value proposition. How do can I please sample this at home? Why do I have to go somewhere? A lot of this is done from venous blood. It could be done from finger prick blood. We need more home collection solutions for this, so that I can do this without, again, having to show up in any of those collection centers or doctor offices. And I think that just speaks to the same thing. There's a lot of science that still needs to be figured out. Neal, as you heard as well from the people who are at the front lines every day, and in measuring, well, what are the antibody levels? When do they go up? Do they always go up? Does it mean in immunity? And we need to give scientists the time to really go through this before we make conclusions. But I think eventually we're going to get there. And then it's really, again, also deploying this testing. How do we make it accessible for everybody? Because we need to know, what the infection rates are, and it impacts not only personal decisions, but also decisions of how you open the economy. So it's a whole big field, and I'm sure Chris and you have more questions on that, but I think
What was interesting in all of the hours we spent trying to dissect this specific question was the complexity of some of the tests. And we've spent a bunch of time talking to Eric about some of the complexity on the tests too on the podcast. But I wonder if you might try and sum it up in like under a minute, literally, without what the summary of how do you explain the complexity to somebody who doesn't have the 8 hours to spend with you, like Chris right this moment, so that he understands a little better about why this is not an easy answer and why you're not willing to just hand him a test and put your name on it.
Yes. And so specific, I mean, we have two tests that we always consider, right? One is the test for an active infection, where you're looking for the virus, or, as you probably heard in a lot of press releases and public statements, the viral RNA. Mm-hmm. And you can do that only when there's an active infection. So you need to time that right. And that comes from where the virus is replicating. So you have to go for nasal swabs or sputum or a throat swab. And just to show you the complexity, when people validate tests, they do that from banked samples, right? So samples where the true answer. But the sampling itself that is done by a nurse has some form of a variance itself that can lead to false results. And so that's a process that you can't control when you're testing in a laboratory. And that has to always be considered. And I think it's hard for somebody who's not in this field to understand where all the failure points are. But again, also, you can't use that test once the symptoms have subsided, for example, right, and you're past your actual infection. So now you need to figure out, when is the testing window to find out, did I have an infection and my immune system responded to it by forming antibodies, that basically recognize part of the virus particle. And that you can't do right away either. There's enough literature from other viruses we know to know how long it takes, and you have to wait 2 to 3 weeks before you have a measurable response. In this case, you do it from blood, as to what the antibody response may be. But you need to understand, what is the body responding to, which virus particles are there that were, and how do I measure which type of immune response really will give me some form of immunity. And you need to really look at that in detail, and study it in a lot of different samples to make sure that response of the immune system and the antibodies that we're forming is kind of not only there in people who are severely infected, but also there in people with mild symptoms or nearly no symptoms, because it helps characterize how you go forward from there. And you really need to validate that also against other viruses. For example, other coronaviruses, like common cold is a coronavirus, right? So you need to make sure that your tests don't give you a positive result for a virus that you're actually not interested in, because you really want to know, is there an immune response for COVID specifically? So a lot of things to look for. And then there's, again, even for blood, the sampling question, could I do this from finger prick amounts of blood? And what kind of degradation of the sample is allowable, right? And if you send a kit to somebody and tell them, hey, prick your finger at home, drip your blood into this container, and then ship me that container back, it may be in the mail for 2 days, it may get heat, that may degrade the blood. Is the test still going to work after 48 hours or whatever the travel time of the sample is? So there's a lot of validation work you have to do, and a lot of angles you have to think about to really make it robust, because the last thing you want is to give false results and false assurance to people. And then explaining the result as well. You can go onto blogs and find out that people get a negative antibody test and they're happy. They say like, wow, it's great news. I'm negative for the antibody. And they clearly haven't understood what a negative result means. It's always in the context, right? If you're testing for an active infection and you come back negative, yeah, that's a good result. You don't have it. But then if you're testing for an antibody, you get back a negative result. That's not good, because very likely in the current world, you want to be positive and assume that you will have developed some immunity.
Dirk, I want to suggest
So-
you don't troll Twitter looking for these answers regularly during work hours, just as a shareholder.
No, absolutely not. But it is-
I am pretty
it is
surprised by
sometimes
people's
interesting.
reaction, though. I'm with you. Like, we're negative. Like,
Yeah,
for
no,
what?
I mean-
Tell me what you think you're negative for.
Yeah. But it's part of what you have to do to understand how people will deal with this. And in particular in medical testing, that's where you have to have that physician interaction as well. We very often like to talk about patient-initiated, physician-mediated testing, because we really want to drive testing towards the opportunity that patients can initiate it, but you do want the physician involved in these, because they need to explain the results so that people do not take away the wrong thing from the test results. At least where it's medically relevant, and a misinterpretation could lead
All right.
to harm.
So I don't want Chris to ask questions. So Chris, sorry. I have two specific questions. How many years do you think until we're kind of out of the fear of COVID-19 as a biologist, not necessarily as a citizen? Meaning, I understand fear can last longer. And do you think we'll see another pandemic in our lifetimes? And what kind of range do you give it until we see it again?
That's actually, that's a very detailed question.
I know you're German, and I know you're very detailed about everything. Is there any chance we could get a...
Let me give you a little, I think we will have to deal with COVID-19 through 2020 and probably into 2021. Not because I'm an expert in this, but if you just go through what I explained in terms of how much we have to study still to understand this, and we all want to understand does this give immunity? But until you have all those answers, we will need to be
Do you
careful.
think we're more likely to go on summer vacation in 2022 then? Just, this is me asking you as a biologist, not as an expert.
I would, I for sure hope that maybe we can do it in 2021. But 2022 is probably a lot safer. I think what will help a lot is having a vaccine. I think the whole the way this will go, and you can't really skip process steps as much as there's pressure to get this all done really quickly. You do still need to do the right trials and everything. And if this shapes out to be more like hepatitis B, where you need, you give a vaccine, then you do antibody measurements, and then see what the response is, and you may have to do a second or a third before you truly get immunity, then that may take longer. If we're lucky, it's not quite as like hepatitis B, then things may go a little quicker, but it will take its time to get an approved vaccine, and then you need to get the production up, and you need to deploy it. And you need, again, testing to see if there is the appropriate response to the vaccination. And then we need to still study how is the virus mutating, and how much are we going to give immunity? Is this going to be like flu, where you basically have to go for a flu shot every year? So, it's everybody wants answers today, but sometimes science needs patience. And I'm sure everybody knows there's so many groups working on this, but I personally am not planning on things being normal again in 2020. It's going to take longer, and we need to have certain precautions in place for a while.
Dirk, you have a great imagination for diagnostics and testing. Have you, with your experience in this, seen any other opportunities that you imagine you could seize or would like to attempt? Not to distract you from the work you're doing now, but what do you think has opened up in terms of possibility for you as you watch this unfold?
I think what this reemphasizes is that the thought we started with, which is you need to enable at-home testing. You need to have, if you want, you have your own health ecosystem at home with devices that are available to the whole, family, that have modules that you can run certain tests. this just has more emphasis now, because to Neal's previous question, had you asked me 10 years ago about a pandemic, I probably, it wasn't, every public company does disaster planning and all that. You think about earthquakes and fires and what have you. I'm not sure that it was on the top of the mind that we will be shut down or significantly hampered as businesses due to a pandemic, despite the fact that we had SARS before and MERS and these warning shots. I think this event will help prepare us better for the next one, because there will be a next one, and a lot of it has to do with how the world has evolved and how much we travel and how quick we can get from A to B, and how quickly that will allow infectious diseases to
hitch a ride, hitch a ride along the way.
Yeah, no, and imagine Ebola would have a longer time in which you're symptom free. That would be a disaster, because it's deadly, but you don't know, let's say for 1.5 weeks you have it, and how many places you can go. We have just seen it with COVID. People were at a conference and then they go skiing in the Alps or wherever they went, and then they go somewhere else, and you can trace it. And so I think this happened, and we need to react to it, and we need to be much better prepared in how we set up testing and monitoring and taking care of people in a remote setting. And I think a lot of innovation will be in that. Among that is what we had in mind, which is how to have disposable devices that you can run at home and throw away, even if it's only for triaging, even if it only says, you need to talk to a doctor, versus no, you probably had an allergy or whatever. There will be other things, Chris, to your question. If you think about the space program and other things, and there's so many little side things that come out of that turn into business,
right?
Yeah, and it's material.
Wait, Chris, say that again, real quick. What were you saying?
Titanium ballpoint pens came out of the
or your toothpaste tube.
Some
right, but you see the necessity that comes out of some of these programs leads to so many new areas that get funded, because now there's a real need there, and I think we'll see that here too. And a lot of it will have to do with how you test for this, how do you monitor it, but it goes further, as you have seen. How many people have never thought about not going to a supermarket to buy food, and realize now, it's actually pretty easy to not have to do that. And so I think there will be opportunities in the whole logistics chain that will expand. Amazon is already a very big player in all kinds of logistics. Or will they fast forward into more of the medical logistics and the sample logistics and giving access on a more massive scale? I think there's a number of different areas where this will make a huge change over the next 5 to 10 years.
Do you imagine that at-home testing could be so specific as to include something like a serology test? Test for antibodies?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's where I think you go from maybe very specific testing to, as a father, right? You always have in the family, in the moment the kids go to school, you have strep throat and all that kind of stuff, and it would just be good to already be able to test for some of these things at home. You can expand that. It's just a modular thing. Do I want to monitor an active infection? Do I want to monitor an antibody response? It simplifies how much time you have to spend elsewhere, which is, I think, another important thing. Right now, nobody wants to spend time in the doctor's office and get infected by somebody else. But in general, it's also a time sink, right? How many times do you have to make a doctor appointment and then do a phlebotomy appointment, which is somewhere else, because it's all centralized through Quest and LabCorp and other bigger companies, which if you could shortcut that and just do more things in a home setting, including the sample collection. Even if you don't interpret the results yourself, you can, we have all the cloud computing, we have encryption, everything to handle a lot of this stuff through cloud transfer into an electronic health record, into portals that a physician can review. I think there's a lot more opportunity there. You just have to focus on valuable information. And that's, I think, the difference to a lot of the attempts that may have been there in the last couple of years. When it gets too recreational, the question becomes, why do I need to do this? At that point, it becomes a minority of the population that is interested, that is willing to pay for it. We're looking for what is high value information that is actionable, and how you can bring that kind of testing home. And if, the one thing, and I told that to Neal in previous discussions, managing chronic diseases with much more at-home testing would be fantastic, right? If you have autoimmune diseases, and in particular now, right? Think about all the people who are on immunosuppressants who really have to be worried about getting infected. Can I have simple testing devices at home that allow me to predict the flare-up, so that my doctor can recommend more in real time to change my drug treatment, dosing, and what have you? There's a lot of opportunity there. And sometimes it requires an event like this to really get this off the ground and convert people over.
Well, and Chris, we see deals regularly for single point testing. Like we actually see tests for strep, and we see tests for other bacterial come across our desk. Other bacterial infections come across our desk regularly enough. It's rare that you get a chance to see a platform.
Well, this may be a question then for both of you. Then, when you say you're looking for that high value data or information, what are the value markers you most likely to search for? What information would you what markers do you attribute to see the most value to specific data or information or tests?
Yeah, Chris. So a way to answer that for me is actually was the opposite. When we're talking about recreational information, what I mean is, there's part of the population who may be interested in certain nutritional things and certain hormone markers that are purely recreational. Mm-hmm. That for me is in the eye of the person who wants that information. It may be valuable, but not to everybody. What I mean is, for example, anything that you measure that impacts how you treat a person, how you can improve the quality of their life. That's a high value marker, right? So in multiple sclerosis or any of those diseases, predicting flare-ups, that's a high value marker. Anything where you need to change the drug treatment is a high value marker. But I would still argue infectious disease is high value too, because there's an action, right? There's a result of that, and you could argue, and those are, sexually transmitted disease is one of those areas where people don't want to see a doctor, they're embarrassed, they don't want to talk to anybody. But if there's a simple way for them to test, do I have an infection, and get them into, well, if you are having an infection, you should see a doctor and be treated. That's still high value for me, right? And I think that's what we're looking out for is there an action that follows it that is useful for improving the health, wellness, and and fitness, even if you want, for the person. Does that help?
Yeah, tremendously. Thank you. Neal, you have anything you want to add to that?
No.
From a higher 30,000 foot view?
No. The reason I was excited to invest in Juno is because I thought, it was a chance to, invest in a point of care device. Let me put it in more plain English. I invested in Juno because I thought, they were creating the iTunes of biomarkers, and at some point, using their device, we could test for, hundreds of diseases, hundreds of viruses, for astronomically low costs. And that's why I'm afraid Dirk will sell his company too early.
What's too early?
You brought it up twice now,
Right.
and I'm wondering, you're probably going to go there a third time.
We can bring it up later. Like,
It'll be a third and a
you
fourth
know
time.
what too early is just like you rarely meet a team that that can 100% pull off every part of what they want to because they've executed at such a high level before. Like, so we meet great teams. And whenever you meet such a great team, you want to see them meet their entire vision of what's possible, and not just a single product. Even though a single product can really help and get to an exit that is more than happy for all of our investors.
Mm-hmm.
Seeing Dirk realize his entire vision changes the world in really short order, right? So that's the thing that excites me about it, and I'd like to get a chance to potentially see that. Though I'm sure if Dirk sells this company, he'll be back again.
I think so. That was the third time you brought it
There
up.
we go. There we go. I promise not to bring it any more up. Okay.
No, but I think, in back to Chris, I really like your question because to the degree you have to, as a founder and an entrepreneur, you have to be visionary in where you see the future going, and then you have to be practical in how you get started with it, right? So fast forward, I think a world in which we really leverage the fact that we do have information, right? I personally, I have my genome sequence, and you try to learn something from that, and it takes time for actually you need millions of people's sequence to make the right associations as to some of the predispositions and what they mean. But we're entering this where we can derive actionable results from some of this information, and in particular now that we live in a world where there's more and more variables, right? It doesn't have to be an Apple Watch, can be whatever measures your temperature, heart rate, how many steps you take, correlates that information, even where you live, humidity, how much you drink. There's many things you can monitor, and I think we will monitor more and more, even without having to actively do it, because that's a hurdle you always want to take away. You want things to be simple, but being able to aggregate all that and derive consequences from that, in a sense of saying, hey, my algorithms detected I have this genetic information, this variable, it would be good to do this and this test for this biomarker, and then you have to set up a home that will automatically do that and say, this morning this is what I'm going to test for, because if there's an increase in that biomarker, I'm going to notify the doctor, and then the doctor will look at it and the charts and will recommend something. That's kind of where you want to go. And I don't mean that in the sense of everybody is driven by that, but it's taking the opportunity that you have it in improving how we can go about managing our health, right? And you want to get to people before they're patient. That's why we like to also talk about consumers, because if you're a patient, you may be already too late. You want to stay healthy and well.
Well, that's a learning from COVID for sure, right? Right. If you're already having trouble breathing, or if you're advanced, it's too late. So yeah, Dirk, that's fantastic. Thank you. And what's next? I know you've been thinking of adapting your technology for COVID testing.
Yeah, yes, I think we categorize it between near term, medium term, long term. As a company, we're very focused on reproductive health and basically disrupting kind of the market that we opened up in non-invasive prenatal testing previously, and really bringing a different angle to it in terms of really looking at the whole workflow of the interaction of a pregnant woman with a physician, and how we can make that a better experience, and how we can lower the cost of it so that we have much broader availability and adoption of valuable testing. And that's just for practical reasons, because that's an area we know really well, and an area we have executed well in before. as the first mover, and but I think it will give us the platform and basis to then expand into other areas. And a natural area is infectious diseases, and I think it would be prudent to make sure that for the follow phases, if you want, of COVID and any future pandemics, that there's vision of what we have at-home testing solutions for this becomes more of a reality, so that what we went through here in the US, but also other countries in January, February, March, maybe in the future can be done much quicker, and more real-time decisions can be made as to how severe it is and how we handle it. And so I think that's an area we remain very interested in. We are still relatively small, so there's a lot that academic research and doctors and hospitals will still have to research, in particular to COVID. But I think it's a jumping off point to show the power of having disposable infectious disease testing that can be done at home, and that circumvents a lot of the issues that we just observed in the last couple of months.
Dirk, you and I were talking yesterday about how we thought, the Sputnik helped launch the space race, and how COVID may be launching, and you've talked about it a little bit here, the health race, if you will. I'm curious about what things you're most excited to see over the next, coming little bit of time. We'll call it under a decade. What trends are you most excited to see, like explored? What specific technologies, if any?
I think I'm mainly focused, of course, on diagnostics, despite the fact I think you when you talk even about diagnostics, it's broader than just diagnostic testing, because it is always also the patient-physician relationship, and how you transfer data, how you make things easily interpretable and handleable, and how you have telehealth solutions as well. Because one thing we didn't talk much about, but it's a huge topic, is if you look at the hospitals, the number of elective surgeries has gone down drastically, but they're actually driving a lot of the revenue of the hospitals. I think the other area, which is actually a bad thing as well, is that people don't go to the physician office anymore because they're worried, but they should, because they have chronic diseases or something else, and they should be seen, but they decide not to. And so I think what excites me is that this is an opportunity to revamp all of those processes that frankly evolved over decades, and they're just taken as this is just how it is, and we have to deal with it. And I don't think it has to. We have centralized processing because that's where in the past the economics were the best. You have these big companies like LabCorp and Quest that are really operational with their own airplanes and what have you, and the test menu very strong, but they come with a huge disadvantage in terms of turnaround time and all those things. And I think if you bring the right technology to the market that is cost efficient, then you can change that whole paradigm. And it will actually bring medical innovation to the market quicker too, right? If you think about, if there's a blood highway, which we have here in the US, then the blood highway is controlled by the people who can draw blood. So that requires a phlebotomist, and the phlebotomist costs money. So, bigger companies may have their own phlebotomy network. Smaller companies who want to bring medical innovation to the market don't have that. So there's an access hurdle that will delay the introduction of that innovation. So if you make yourself independent of the blood highway, now things can move much quicker. And I think all these roads lead to at-home testing, at-home sampling solutions, remote, or telehealth if you want. There's a whole paradigm shift that can be impacted here that is going to be beneficial for the consumer and the patient. And frankly, if done right, it will be beneficial for the physician as well, because they can focus on treating the patient, not worrying about logistics in scheduling of appointments and getting calls on when test results are back and what have you. You want to relieve them of all that burden so that they can spend the time they have really in that patient interaction. And that's what excites me, because we need change in that. We have been doing it the same way for a long time. And the solution is not to take things out of the hand of the physician. We just need to make it simpler and more efficient for both sides, and that will hopefully allow to spend the time there is really on that physician-patient interaction and getting the care transmitted that really needs to be there. I hope that kind of points you in the direction of what I'm
starts to. I've been disappointed on the specificity of your answers today. Normally I get, but I typically am, right? Some of the time I think I get really good at very specific yes and no's. Here's what I think, we'll go with your framework though. That's probably a lot better to think through.
Dirk, I want to.
Well, I think. Yep. Sorry.
Oh no,
Chris,
it's fine. I just in thinking about this in the diagnostic space specifically, is there a sort of Moore's law, or have there been rapid advances in spectrometry or in ways that you can get more detailed test results from smaller sample sizes? Is that
I think.
advanced?
Yeah, I
exciting?
think. Yeah. So the way I think you should think about this is you have to use the right tool for what the question is. And I've seen it in my career many times, is that people come up with a fancy tool and apply it to a simple question, and that's not cost effective. But for example, right, a lateral flow readout can be extremely effective, and lateral flow is a mature technology that is cheap to manufacture, and it does the job depending on what the question is. But at the same time, of course, the innovations in how we look at genetic information, sequencing technology, maybe array technology, optical methods, all that that improves constantly will lead to cheaper and more efficient technology that can be deployed at home. And now, of course, if you use a readout that uses semiconductor technology, then Moore's law applies to that and applies to the cost reduction as well. And so I think maybe things haven't moved quite as quickly in the past as a lot of people wished, including myself, but within the next 10 years, they will. And then it becomes a question, not so much of the cost once you hit that point where you can read many things at home, but it becomes a question of how do you responsibly transmit that information to the patient and still focus on what's actionable, because the last thing you want to do is produce a lot of information that nobody knows what to do with, right? That's where you
the answer to your question, Chris, was no. I just want to point that out.
Answered in nice way. Right? And don't, Chris, it's not a hard no. I think it's no, definitely there will be technology advances that will make an impact, but I don't think it's going to follow Moore's law in the way that we have seen it in other areas of
well, and it could pass it too, right? Like I actually, looking at lots of diagnostics every day or regularly at Zoic, I do think the advancement of what I'm seeing now versus what I saw, 3 years ago, and thinking about where I think that the health race leads, while we can't give you a law today, and while the answer might be technically no, I do think that we'll see some pretty spectacular advancements. Even just talking to my friend who works at HoloLens and the things that they're able to share with you at, whether they share it with you or not, the things that they're able to read based on all of this VR equipment are very fascinating as well. So that's why I'm always convinced that tech companies are trying to become healthcare companies.
Yes, and I agree with that. I mean, and I think a lot of companies that are in very different fields, I think will eventually make an impact in healthcare too. I mean, I brought up Amazon. I'm still convinced that Amazon eventually, in a very measured way, will encroach into that space. and it makes sense to me because there's a lot of logistics to solve in healthcare too that they can make an impact on. But there's also a lot of data that we can make an impact on. You probably heard a lot about big data and artificial intelligence. I tend to not like these buzzwords, but there is of course a lot of useful developments in that field that can be applied in order to make analysis quicker. And the health ecosystem that I brought up is, of course, using these things at the backbone, because you need a decision maker, and the data gets so complex that it's very likely that a doctor needs some pointers, because correlating all this data is incredibly difficult, not for the right algorithm, but for a human. But you had another question in there that I think is important, and that is the sampling itself. And my warning is always, you have to know what you're looking for and how much is there, because you can't magically measure something where there's not enough, right? We all have seen the public debacles of certain companies that were promising something that just can't be done in that way. So you have to have the right scientific basis. And, for example, if we're talking finger prick, you got to know how much is there of what material in that finger prick, and that will define the limits, right? A thought process, right? If you have only one molecule in a finger prick per a certain volume, right? Then as you take your finger prick, you sometimes may have the molecule in there and sometimes you don't. And there's no technology that will solve for when you don't. So you need to understand those limitations and then come up with
The
solutions.
technology is a knife.
Yeah, right. But you know what I mean, right? You sometimes have to realize that a drop of blood for this application is just not going to be sufficient, because I can't measure anything with the right sensitivity for the biomarker I'm interested in. And then there's other applications where a few drops of blood are perfectly fine. And that's where you can enable things at home. Or, we have many other sources that we can go for in the body. You just got to study it. You got to know what you're looking for, and you got to know, can I actually do this from a sampling perspective? And then I think things can work out fine. If you don't do that, that's when you get yourself in trouble, and it turns out that what you were measuring was garbage, or you flat out lied about what you can do.
Yeah.
And we all know what company I'm referring to.
We all know. Well, you also had a Serpico moment, which is even more amazing and a testament to your integrity. I'm also very happy to talk to you, Dirk, because of the way that your work and your diagnostic thinking is very patient focused. You are thinking, of course, logistically and about the whole process, but very much about that patient experience. So,
yeah, and I think I prefer to look at it that way. And and Neal knows this from our discussions. There's very often a tendency to develop a technology and then figure out how you apply it, and not understanding what is the true thing or workflow or issue I'm solving here. And we tend to look at what is the workflow, what is the use case that needs improvement, and then you figure out what are the different technologies that need to be developed or redeployed to really solve that. And that's how you get, I think, to much better impact than just saying I have a new sensor and that sensor can do this. Well, great, and what next?
Yeah. Thank you, Dirk.
Dirk, we're going to move on with we appreciate your time, and we'd love to have you stay if you'd like. We're going to talk a little bit about the market and a little bit about trends in venture capital. And if you want to stay, great. If you want to contribute, great. And if not, we understand.
No, I'm happy to listen in. We'll see if I can contribute, but I want to see now, Chris, your opinion on the state of the market.
Chris, go.
The Lazarus market, it's risen from the dead. It's pretty remarkable. But this is a lot of unknowns. Normally when we have sustainable rise in the market, it's led by smaller companies medium-sized companies, they're not participating. This is sort of a revival of the big companies that were the last leaders. So I'm not fully convinced. I'm not as constructive on a continuation of this bull market or recovery from the lows as I would otherwise be. But it's not just a stock market; it's a market of stocks, and there are a lot of parts where the market has served us up tremendous value. So so it's very mixed. It's a tale of two cities. If you're in the oil or energy market, might be a lifetime opportunity or a lifetime of pain. We've never seen negative oil prices before. We may never see them again. But lots of things are unprecedented in this time. We just talked about the pandemic, which is certainly among them.
Chris, I'm
So,
betting that you obviously still think we're headed into a bear, or we're in a bear now. What would need to change, and like what would you need to see as a signal that would change your opinion on that? I guess there's probably like 100 things that could do it. Maybe you can give us a little bit of enlightenment about the framework of how you would think about that even.
Well, everything right now, I think, is getting the Barry Bonds asterisk, right? There's the COVID. Through no fault of their own, companies and the economy fell off a cliff. That isn't a durable enough reason for me to believe that we can just skip over this valley of abysmal economic performance. And I think, too, we're already starting to see it shake out, of course, starting in the shale patch with the fracking companies, the bankruptcies, the dividend cuts, capital expenditure cuts, which, again, all these ripples are emanating out from really just this tremendous lack of revenue. Delta announced that their April sales are down 95%, ticket sales. So they're certainly the plight of companies in travel and leisure is unevenly, they've been unevenly hurt by this virus. It's not been a very level playing field. Some companies have benefited from it. Of course, we talked about Amazon. But again, to just skip over this or think that somehow the fiscal or monetary authorities can remedy this when real profits and earnings are what drive stock prices and the value of companies is, to me, to just gloss over something that's too important to miss. And also the signature profile of a bear market is, a sharp sell-off followed by a reflexive rebound, and then a more long and drawn-out fundamental decline. And that, I think, is still in the cards as we start to digest the real economic impacts of COVID.
Interesting. So what would you be actually saying to your clients today based on where the portfolio sits in general?
Well, no one can tell you, a lot of questions revolve around if I've got cash that I didn't deploy, is now a time to deploy it, or have I missed the opportunity? If I am fully invested, should I consider taking some profits? And, a lot of the larger investment banks and analysts we follow, of course, are kind of monolithic, like stay invested. But I can't say that, give advice in a general sense for everyone. It does depend on your time frame and other factors, but that's a big one. The real fact of the matter is, if you own companies or investments with strong balance sheets and solid cash flow and you didn't pay too much for them, you should hold them. If you see some that are out there like that, you should buy them. No one can tell you to spend all of your money today, but equally, no one should tell you not to invest some of it when you see a very compelling opportunity. So it is mixed, but again, I think mostly we're still guarded because we do expect maybe not a revisitation of the lows, but certainly some challenge to this rebound. It's not based on anything fundamental. And again, too, it's being driven especially by small retail investors. Larger investors, insiders, those the so-called smart money groups are generally net sellers. And then, if you paid attention to Warren Buffett, American Idol in investing, his show on Sunday, the Berkshire Hathaway annual shareholders meeting, which he delivered um, through Yahoo, was very strange. First, there was no audience, which is always
Well, it's
weird.
delivered on Yahoo. I mean,
Um,
let's start there.
Yeah,
Wouldn't have been my first choice.
but the whole thing is kind of surreal. It's just part of this world we're in now. But I've never seen him so cautious. Maybe he is 89 years old, and he did hold up some very simple cards. The last one saying "Don't bet against America," which is one of his rallying cries, but it sort of sounded more like a whimper than a cry. Maybe that's a little too harsh, but definitely it lacked the drive and energy of his previous um, encouraging rallying cries. This, I think, is important because he has his finger on so many points in industrial America through his ownership of Burlington Northern Santa Fe, the rail line. He can see what's being moved around the country in terms of rail car loadings. He can see with everything up to See's candies what consumers are spending or not spending. It's just fascinating, and he gets that information in real time. So his caution is something certainly is not easy to dismiss, and I share in a measure of it too. Um, and he also just roundly sold all the
Right,
airlines he owned. He hadn't
right.
owned for very long, and he didn't make any excuses. To his credit, he just said he made a mistake, and he didn't think that passenger miles were going to recover anytime soon. So, again, there were some sobering words and some thoughts, but first, we'll survive. I think this will hopefully bring about some more sober pricing in parts of the market that have gotten away from us. But it's also very fascinating to see. Normally, when a market changes, if there's a bear market and then a resumption or a bull market ensues, the leadership changes. That hasn't happened. Small and mid cap stocks haven't participated to the same extent as the larger companies have. That's leaves us less than constructive. And then again, it's small retail investors who've been driving this rather than more sophisticated or larger investors, and certainly insiders buying their own shares. And that's just the the qualitative aspects. Quantitatively, buybacks have been slashed, capital expenditures have been slashed, and buybacks were one of the biggest sources of support for the stock's prices in this market. There have been huge buybacks. I don't want to talk about the politics of it all, but
Are
just
you sure?
that was a source of open market. Well, no, I am. No, it's rated, but because that'll take us down another path. But I just think that's just from the supply and demand and the demand aspect of it, that pillar of demand is now crumbling. And corporations, it's very funny. It just reveals they're made up of people, and they're just like us, like retail investors. Most corporations buy the most at the top and the least at the bottom when their shares are undervalued. They're not doing buybacks, but on the way up, they're buying a lot. So,
It's definitely been interesting to watch. Dirk, I'm curious. Do you have any specific questions? Not about your specific stock portfolio, just to throw that out there,
Yeah.
but about the market.
No. What I'm most wondering about, and because of course you talk to people, you talk to financial advisors, and they tell you all along, oh, the market has already priced everything in. They said that in March, and they said it in April, and only if the numbers are a lot worse than what was anticipated is going to go down. I have a hard time with that because I don't know that anybody knows how the next 3, 6, 9 months are going to unfold, right? You brought up airlines, rental cars, um, hotels, but also restaurants around the town, right? I'm not quite sure how this is really going to unfold and if we have really seen the worst yet, just because we're looking at unemployment rates or whatever. Um, it's and that's kind of where my question goes is how do you, in the absence of really knowing what's going to unfold and how we're going to deal with this, how do we even know how the recovery will look like? There's no doubt, that once you can be totally back to normal, things will, except for the people who don't have money to spend anymore, other things will go back to normal. But there's all this in between phase where I'm just not sure how long of a air, if you want, people have to withstand this. And you see the signs, right? There's restaurant chains that basically say it's sorry, we have to close down. We will not survive this, and we're not going to recover. And it's not the mom and pop shop, but it's actual solid chains that decide this is it.
Yeah, and even those that seem they still had some years of life left in them, like a Neiman Marcus or something, they're retailers. It's uh, in the same way that the virus itself, the COVID disease, has affected certain groups disproportionately versus others. It's landed unevenly on the economy. Clearly, hotels and retails and shopping malls and the opera houses. I mean, when are you going to get 3,000
Right. Not
elderly
for a
people?
couple of years.
Yeah, yeah. So you're right, Dirk. No one knows the future ever. It's just that most days, Friday looks like Thursday. It's been made clear to us that is a luxury and is not always the case. Um, but this is a very open question, and we think about it a lot. If we look across this valley, what are indispensable industries, and can they be had? And do they have solid balance sheets to make it? And can they be had at a reasonable or a good price? And do they have excellent management? There are a few other markers, but when I look at this, the essential nature of that is important. I just and also you have to wonder, like one of the things that always irks me when we have a crisis. For example, this time you heard congressmen saying, "Well, we need airlines when we come out of this." Well, of course we're going to have airlines. If it's not Delta, someone
Right.
will own and fly those planes. Someone will have productive assets. You don't want them as an investor taken away from you, though. You want those productive assets when the economy comes back. So again, having the staying power is important. So it's unknown, but there are some that are just too tough. Like I mentioned opera, theater, things like that, not necessarily as investment themes, but just as an example of how it's really impossible to know now when those things
So
come back to where they were or close to.
So do you think, along the lines of what you asked me, what are industries and subsectors that you see that suddenly become more important? Just from my own experience, Zoom for,
Right.
kids' school and all that wasn't on the radar, right? And now your bandwidth at home is not sufficient anymore because the kids have school through Zoom meetings and cloud solutions and what have you. I think there's a whole field of technologies evolving there that in parts were already there, but maybe lived a different life, and now they're moving to the prime spot. Are there other industries that are majorly benefiting? By the way, we Airbnb. You have all the gig economy, as people refer to it, that got impacted by this, and we'll see how any of that recovers.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of the super hosts are themselves filing for bankruptcy, unable to meet mortgage payments without
Well, I mean,
Airbnb
I
renters.
thought it was an okay business model for a while. Actually, I was impressed by it. You can own your own mini hotel chain without having to put up a lot if you're willing to hustle on Airbnb and market yourself. Suddenly, it no longer works.
Neal, there have been so many assets that 2 months ago looked impregnable. Mortgage bonds that were 20 years old, where there was a huge amount of residential real estate equity backing them. These pools of mortgages have suddenly become questionable because people can't pay it or need deferments, and we don't know how that's going to unfold. It's fascinating how some of what seem the most secure assets or wonderful business models have met this crisis and have stumbled. You know, but Dirk, to your point, I think you mentioned Zoom. It's fascinating. You also mentioned telemedicine. All of those things I'm pretty impressed by. Zoom's a free service, so I don't understand the stock price action except that it's garnered the public's imagination, which is enough, I guess, in the short term to drive it higher. But it's a free service. But I also am impressed with how quickly they've responded and made the service better. And those improvements, I think, are fascinating. The Some of the existing infrastructure, I think, which was already inexpensive, and here I'm thinking of the whole energy complex. I mean, I'm with everyone that we should preserve hydrocarbons, but still, they generally are responsible for powering most of the world. And that whole old energy space has just collapsed um, for all sorts of reasons. But this is probably generationally an opportunity. That's not anything that's necessarily new. It's just one of those things that has been affected by a demand shock that's tremendous, as with the airlines and some others. And then on top of that, which is unique to the oil markets, you've had a supply shock that's been tremendous and foolish, but tremendous. So you add those two together, you get a really unique cocktail that's a once in a lifetime concoction, maybe. We'll see. The problem with investing in anything energy is the price of oil and the politics around it. But that's one space where things look very, very inexpensive, extremely cheap generationally. Shipping and some of the transportations and logistics companies. Um, we those are the backbone of global commerce, and they've been forgotten both from the legacy of the trade war with China and now just the basic shutdown of the ports, which are gradually reopening. So those things look very attractive just from a standing.
Are you feeling better about
valuation
the
standpoint.
currency of both India and China right now? I guess it's going to go down. Are you feeling good about shorting those currencies?
Well, India's got real economic
Yes, but
growth
if China
ahead,
devalues the currency, as you
and it
suggested,
seems
could
like,
happen next week. It seems likely. India would probably follow suit. So
yeah, and the dollar has been just tremendously strong, as it usually is in a crisis. Like um, there are a lot of dollar liabilities, even in foreign countries, dollar denominated bonds, and that creates a scramble for more dollars. And it's the most widely held currency. So it's just risen really in the face of most others. The ruble and certainly emerging market currencies like India's, the Turkish lira, all of those things have fallen dramatically against the dollar. I think that China holds a tremendous weapon in that offshore yuan, and if they devalue it, it would send deflationary shocks throughout through a lot, especially of the developing world. And it would affect the U.S., of course, because they hold a lot of assets here and abroad. Um, that's something they may not choose to do, but they can always threaten to do, which is a good negotiating tactic
wait,
or
I
weapon
don't
that
hear
they
you
have.
talking about shorting companies
So
or currencies or commodities very often. Is that something you ever really do?
Um, I did in the banking crisis where I felt I had an advantage and the risk reward was very asymmetric. Um, right now, I just don't feel that I have the same insight in a lot of ways. I do think consumer spending is going to drop. I do think certain companies like credit card companies, et cetera, may feel the pinch. But I don't think I have any unique insight
Got it.
that gives me an advantage
That makes sense.
to make kind of play yet.
Maybe let's move to
but just
the VC corner and actually talk a little bit about some of the trends in venture capital. And before we ask Dirk about what he thinks about valuations of companies and where they're going and fundings, kind of notable to me, and Dirk will definitely ask you about the valuation of sports teams here. You can join the discussion here. I saw a couple of funds start, or in the news, in the venture capital news, the private equity news, that were going to buy minority ownerships in sports teams. And I thought that's pretty interesting. Can the NBA, can the EPL, English Premier League, or Bundesliga, just because Dirk's German and he probably likes some soccer team there, can these valuations of these sports franchises stay so large, and or are these funds really just forming to buy out when people are more distressed than the minority shareholders? I'm just kind of curious in general. Do you think the Cowboys can really be worth $2 billion 5 years from now? I know you don't specialize in investing in sports teams. Let me start with that. Yeah, both of you. I'm just curious what you think in general, Dirk and you.
Yeah, I'm pretty quiet on that one. I don't know if I have any unique insight. As Charlie Munger would say,
no vanity ownership me. Okay, nothing to think. You don't think about it.
But I do think a lot about that now, because in the same way we talked about the Metropolitan Opera, when are you going to get 75,000 people in a stadium again? And what does that do to valuations? And especially if you're a second-tier team like the Atlanta Hawks in the NBA or something, what happens to your valuation?
Dirk?
But think about also, I mean, it's not just people in the stadium, it's everything else in terms of the TV rights for, all of that takes a major
Aren't
hit.
TV rights worth more?
And that's why.
With us being stuck at home?
But I don't think that's going to continue if you have empty stadiums. I'm not a big TV person, but have you watched American Idol without the audience? The ratings have collapsed, down some 56% week by week. It's just amazing to see that. Amazing in the true sense, awesome in the sense of inspiring awe, to see those ratings collapse. Without an audience, there's something in the human condition where it's not exciting. I noticed this with the Buffett dialogue. Without the audience to cue us into how we should
I noticed
respond,
with Jimmy Fallon.
excitement,
I
fervor,
watched
whatever.
His opening monologue one day, and I was like, "This is terrible." I actually really enjoy the audience, and not just a laugh track couldn't make up for what I thought was missing.
But that's exactly why they have a laugh track, right? To give you, it's something about the mimicry of human nature that we see and that inspires us. And I'm only bringing this up because I think without the large live audience, you do lose value. Even in terms of the TV rights, who's going to watch it? And those things lead to.
So these funds are in for an
valuation.
interesting place in the short and medium term. Because I do think some of this stuff will recover when we can go back. Like, why wouldn't we go and enjoy seeing American Idol live, I guess, is your example.
Right. But Neal, also think about it that way. There is a capital need with any of these, right? I mean, you can follow the headlines. Not every, let's take, because you brought it up, I'm German. Of course, I follow the German Bundesliga. Although I would argue
you seemed so nice up until just now.
Manager. But it is not easy to go that long of a time in the active season, right? Because we're not talking off season, we're talking active season and loss of income while maintaining salary cost and what have you. So you could also argue there's an opportunity to buy a stake in something that will recover its value in the long run, but it's
certainly interesting to see. and interesting, it made me just think about the themes I don't think about in venture capital in general. One of the things we're obviously wrestling with, along with everybody else, is the amount of financings that we're looking at, is the lack of financings happening in the market. When do you think VC financings will start to resume pace? Dirk, any thoughts about that? I know you don't study that market all the time. You probably are just an occasional participant, not a not a random. Yeah,
not a random. That will be. But so I think we should potentially clarify what we're observing right now. And I'm not saying that my sample is the biggest, right? You probably have a better view on this, but there's a psychology here that when this all started, probably of VC funds preserving their resources, and the first order of business being, let's make sure that the portfolio companies we have can be supported before we take on new. Then you may move into the phase of saying, hey, but we have time on our hands. I have I don't have hard data, but I feel like stories are being listened to more because there is more time. But because the personal element is missing, you may have dragged out processes and maybe a little gun shy to act unless there's a super opportunity. So I don't know if I think there's going to be, or there were in the last months, more deals being looked at because there's more time, but I'm not sure that many of them closed. But I think recently we did see activity on IPOs for some of the pharma startups that looked actually pretty good. And there's probably a mix of seize the good opportunities you see and take advantage of it now and invest. And maybe in the current times, you can get a deal at a lower valuation than you would have had. And I'm saying this from the perspective of the VC. I think this will improve quicker. The only question is, where in the diligence process do you need that personal interaction and that physical visit? And I'm speculating, but let's say when it gets to certain instrumentation, whatever, what are the means of diligencing the opportunity in a remote fashion? And a lot of it will also go back to what's the team, what's the track record of the team. So I think you have to shift in how you diligence an opportunity, given the fact that there's still no travel and we don't know when travel will open up. So you being the investor, you can reciprocate maybe my thoughts.
Yeah, I actually think people will stay scared. Lots of funds will close. There are lots of big funds that closed after the 2008 downturn. 0809 crisis, and I think this will be no different. I think we're going to see lots of people who get hesitant to invest. Those who survive are the ones who and thrive are the ones who follow their thesis, because it was constructed and it still works to some degree, unless your thesis is just to follow trends.
Stop talking.
Yeah, unless you're SoftBank. So it's interesting to watch, and obviously the number of financings is down dramatically. When I think about the best way to meet a team, I don't actually worry as much about meeting the team, as strange as that may sound. I didn't worry about investing in your team before I met you, or coming to your lab, because we spoke so much of the same language, and you informed us about what we were missing, and we understood your technology, and we understood like the data couldn't have been fabricated. So it was easy for us to say that made sense. Of course, we did come visit you, but I would have been nearly as comfortable making the investment without it. And that's probably the case for a lot of the things we look at. Now, there are some things you want to see in person just to see how it's working. We invested in a company called ODS, and they have a Raman spectroscopy, we'll call it pen, a light pen that can detect cancer cells by touching human tissue. And so we wanted to see it in a oncology surgery. So we wanted to go see that in person. We thought that made more sense. So it kind of depends on the phase, depends on the VCs and whether they really understand the space or not, and whether they're really following it, following a new trend or something that they've invested in a bunch of times and are trying to add to their portfolio with. Does that start to help you out in some way thinking about it, Dirk?
No, absolutely. I think I see it the same way. If you take the drug discovery area, for example, there's a lot you can do. Because you're looking at really, more what pathways are you impacting and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot you can do remotely. I think it's a case by case, but from the companies, the discussions we had at Juno, but also the companies I'm advising, I think if you have a strong case, you still get the audience. But if you're a little bit off the beaten path, it may get a little more difficult, right? So the value propositions that resonate even more now is when you talk about at-home sampling, at-home testing, and it goes through microbiome, many different areas, right? Where as long as you can show how you avoid the complications, the logistical complications, and the fact that your business may not be impacted by the pandemic.
Yes, because obviously
gets you much
investing in venture capital is a longer cycle. So a lot of the investments won't even be thinking about the pandemic the same way when it'll be kind of in the rearview mirror, even though we can still see it. There are kind of a couple more things I'm curious about related to how you're mentoring companies. I know you mentor over a dozen companies, and it's always been kind of good flow for you, and you were able to hire even one of the great people who work at your company from a company you once mentored. I've been reading more about how people are talking to their founders about growth mindset versus mission critical mindset. I've been talking to a number of friends who drew down all of their loans before they violated covenants about growth. It's been interesting, meaning you had to have essentially, 20% month over month growth. And if you didn't hit that, you couldn't borrow again. And of course you weren't going to hit that. So people started borrowing against their bank loans. I'm curious how you're coaching, some of the younger entrepreneurs, even how you're talking to the experienced folks, Dirk, about mission critical versus growth.
Yeah, and so the companies I advise have to hit some personal interest, right? Because time is limited, and I want to make an impact, and the easiest way to make an impact is in areas that you personally care about, passionate about. Among them, for example, I'm very interested in the microbiome field, and as well as in oncology. In oncology, I have a variety of interests. The company I'm advising is in therapy monitoring. There's also a company in veterinary liquid biopsy, dog cancers, and things like that. So I pick where I can make an impact, and the impact you can make differs kind of along the lines of what you said. You look. Very often, if it's a more inexperienced team, what you need to give guidance on is really how to execute and stay focused, right? Because there's always a limited amount of funding initially available, and you need to hit your value inflection point. So it can start with what are those value inflection points that you want to hit, because you need to raise the next round. And how do you get to them, and how do you stay focused on that? But it can also be just guidance on how to do a strategic plan, how to organize board meetings, how do you find the right board members, right? It can vary, and I'll in the context do what I think is the right thing to advise them on.
I want to get more to the heart of the point I was looking for. Are you telling companies to live to fight another day as often, or are you telling them, hey, it makes sense that you actually push ahead further or push again at the same speed you were at before? In general, what's I'm forcing you to generalize here. So
I think I usually, and that is based on experience, I try to advise companies to not overspend and not overgrow too quickly, because You don't want to find yourself in a position where your runway is 3 months, and that just leads to bad deals if you get any. But there are a few exceptions where I would argue that you need to raise more capital because you need to aggressively show adoption. And that, unfortunately, if you're in the consumer marketing, it requires funds to make those, marketing campaigns on Facebook and what have you to show adoption. And if you don't invest the right amount of capital into that, then you get stuck, right? Is there no traction because you didn't spend enough money, or is there no traction because there's no interest in your product? You have to get to that critical volume. And so that's what I mean is you have to advise on what is in the context necessary. If you're already a commercial entity or early pilot phase commercial, you want to invest and show adoption. But if you're in an R&D stage and you overspend on activities that are not leading you to your value inflection point, then you're wasting money, and that may harm you later.
I couldn't agree more. One more reason I knew I didn't need to meet you. We'll end by playing the predictions game, Chris's favorite game of all here. Well, I asked you, and he laughs because I think we're all terrible at predicting things, and yet people ask me a lot about prediction. I ask Chris a lot about prediction. It's just something as a society we're all trying to understand everything for tomorrow, right? How is it going to go? Is it going to ruin my vacation in 2022? Yeah. As I referenced earlier, right? My summer vacation.
The question asked tells more about the questioner than the answer you're receiving.
You know there's a solution, Neal. You just have to buy the right car, a DeLorean, and then just go back into the future.
That's got to be the greatest thing I've ever heard on this podcast, right there. The next pandemic. How many years do you think we'll see one? And then, if so, how many years? You didn't quite answer that earlier.
I think we will see another one. I have a hard time seeing when, but if you look historically, and it's interesting that you keep going back to that question, because I asked myself, did we really not have one, or do we just keep
well, unless they affect us, we forget about them
enough? And yes, and so if you look back, everybody referenced the Spanish flu, but then people forgot about what happened in the 50s, which was I think
or Ebola in the 70s.
As the Asian flu. There have been in kind of a
so let me change it in America. Let me actually be more specific.
Yeah, but America was impacted by those too. Don't forget that. So
do you think
we'll
see one that
probably
gets
see another one in the next 10 years.
Interesting.
Yes,
Chris, keep that in mind as you're looking at the management of these public companies of yours.
Yeah.
No, you Chris, you laugh because I think everybody that's the reaction it is. Yeah. But as a public company, right, there has to be all the planning for any of these eventualities, and I think those plannings will change.
Dirk, you're right. I think that the cost and efficiency will take a backseat to redundancy and readiness. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
I think there's going to be more onshoring. The supply chains are going to have, we've been running just-in-time inventory, which was hailed as a miracle. But once the supply chain breaks, the shelves are bare. There's nothing. There's no inventory anywhere to be had. It's extremely efficient, but it's very fragile. And I think those things are all being exposed and will change.
Last quick prediction question for both of you. And I will also take a guess on this. This is just an yes or no. So, Dirk, no explanation, pretty please. Do you think in the next 2 years that beds in this country in hospitals on average will increase from where we are today? Yeah.
Hospital beds.
I think so too, and I don't really like that answer. There's a lack of capacity to begin with in lots of places, but yeah, I think so. Chris, You and I are playing for charity, Chris. So
I
we're going to track this.
They say, can I
What?
name a number? Is that about
So
the
yeah,
same?
within
10
about the
you're
same
saying
would be
10
within
years from now?
5%, right? No, 2 years from now.
2 years from now. About the same, within plus
Okay.
or minus 5%.
Yeah, so I'm going over on
Probably,
you
but-
for the bet, just so we're clear then. So 6 and up and I win. That was probably not a good bet for you. But a good bet for the Danny Barker Foundation, I think. I think that's probably it for the podcast, Dirk. We really appreciate it.
Yep. No, thank you. It was great discussion, and I hope at some point we can do this in person and maybe meet all the way in Escondido.
Oh, Escondido. Okay, yeah, that's not going to be hard.
That's all for today's episode. I'm Neal Mody, joined by my ever insightful co-host Chris Haydel, and I'd like to thank Dirk for taking the time to appear on today's podcast and wish him and his family good health in these trying times, and all of you as well. I hope all of you are doing well, keeping safe, keeping distancing, and of course, becoming better human beings. Thanks again for joining us on this journey. Please leave us a comment and a rating whenever you get a chance and whatever platform you listen to this podcast on. Thank you.
No, I think it's important though. It's actually the way you think has expanded my thinking for sure. So yeah.
Great. He reminds. It's funny, Neal. I see how we get along too. I can't give a simple answer, and I appreciate that about Dirk. I'm always trying to think through all the nuances and the complexities.
And by night, Chris plays Batman and Buddha.
A lot of times I want to go in, and I was talking to this about Callahan the other day. A lot of times I need to be the expert. When I'm with Dirk, I just want to be the student, right? There's a lot to learn. And I just want to contribute wherever I can. What about you? What's got you busy today?
Oh man, tremendous amount of research. The stock market is rallying. Like nothing's happened. The economy looks like it fell off a cliff.
It doesn't look like it. It did fall off a cliff. Let's just be clear about this.
Well, it did, yeah.
The man, the myth, the legend. The man, the myth, the legend. Dirk Van Den Boom. We can't hear you, Dirk.
Dirk is quiet as a mouse.